The title of Bibi's Room comes from an essay that Zeenath Sajida wrote called Hum Hain To Abhi Raah Mein Hai Sang Gira Aur, which means so long as we exist, there will be obstacles in our path. And what she's doing in this essay is she's talking about the mental load that women bear, in terms of trying to keep a home, trying to maintain a full-time professional career, and on top of that, trying to write. So she, among the various things that she does in this essay, she talks about how women don't have space and time for themselves. And she's drawing from Virginia Woolf's argument. And it's reasonable to make this assumption because we know that Zeenath Sajida was extremely widely read in literatures in many different languages. She extends Virginia Woolf's argument that, that women must give a woman a room of her own, and then, and then see what she can do with that. So she extends that argument and she says that she talks about Bibi, which is, an affectionate way of referring to a young girl or even an older woman. It's often used as a kind of suffix to a name. So she's talking about how Bibi, a young girl, never has a room of her own, truly of her own, is not entitled to her own time, right? And everyone else is entitled to her time. She's not entitled to ask for or get rest, peace of mind, and a space for herself to think and to create. So she says, give a woman a room and time, and then see how she kind of explores and achieves her, creative potential. So the title of Bibi's Room comes from that, as a way of saying that look at what came out of these women's rooms, these three writers who wrote, the things that I talk about in this book. Look at what came out of their rooms. And I'm also trying to use the metaphor of Bibi's Room because Virginia Woolf and I think Zeenath Sajida both are not only talking about literal time and space for women, they're also talking about the need to create space for women in a tradition of writing, right? Make space in the canon, expand your ideas and your constructs of quality and relevance and creativity and creative success, right? And make space for women there. So I'm also trying to suggest, by using this in the title, that there was a particular time when, a particularly favorable time in Hyderabad's history when the conditions were just right for these generations of women writers to emerge, right? And not only were the conditions right, but they created the conditions for themselves to succeed and write and claim their rightful place in the Hyderabadi public sphere. One of the most interesting things about Zeenath Sajida is that her I think it's her essays that are the most remarkable aspect of her legacy, of her literary accomplishment. And the most striking aspect of her essays is the narrator that she has for all these essays that she writes. So she writes these very comical essays that usually document and portray the follies and foibles of the middle class, right? So the narrator that she has is usually a middle class woman who writes about, how she goes through life, how she negotiates a career, how she negotiates having a family. There's a particularly memorable essay where she writes, it's called Makan Bana Dala, where she talks about, what goes into building a house. What does a house represent in terms of the society that we live in today? What does it represent for people living in urban locations? So it's one of the symbols that you have arrived in life, right? So there's a very, very endearing, very comical representation of a slightly naive, homemaking, but also professional woman who, along with her family, decides to build a house, and the ordeal they go through once they realize how much money it involves, how much red tape and paperwork it involves. So it's a very memorable essay, and the most remarkable aspect of it is, as I've said, that the narrator is someone who who's endearing and whom you and whom you can laugh at. So the what we learn from the narrator and the way Zeenath Sajida posits the narrator is that this is not only an essay where these are not only essays where we laugh at other people. We allow people to also laugh at ourselves, because otherwise this would have just been, this would have been a very one-sided kind of, it's different when you laugh at people and when you laugh with people. So I think the really timeless quality of Zeenath Sajida's essays comes from the fact that you have this narrator who says and does funny things, who is a very naive and an endearing person, and so you get to laugh at the things that society does. You get to laugh at other people, but you also in the process allow others to laugh at you. Najma Nikhat, as I've explained in the book, is an important writer for her depiction of particularly women's lives, the lives of different classes of women who lived in the feudal Deodi. So she writes about the lives and the predicaments of upper class begums, as well as their maids, right? So what the life of a working class woman is like in the Deodi. But in addition to that, you do get glimpses of outdoor spaces, particularly landscapes, in Najma Nikhat's work. So for instance, she writes about, she's written about rural locations, and she's written about revolution, for instance, in the villages and so on. But what I also find fascinating is very rare but interesting depictions of the landscapes of Hyderabad. So for instance, Kamal Raj and Nandansar, out of which Nandansar no longer exists. But Kamal Raj is there. It's known as the Lotus Pond now, and people go there to have picnics and so on. Jeelani Bano grew up in a family home where there wasn't a lot of money, so the children had to, come up with creative and innovative ways to entertain themselves. So in the process, they would, organize mushairas and painting exhibitions where they would exhibit their own work. They would read out, the stories and the plays they had written. They would actually perform some of the plays and so on. So there was a very, very strong sense of creative community and activity that was constantly going on in this very vibrant kind of house. And there are these two autobiographical pieces that Jeelani Bano writes. One is an autobiographical essay that she wrote in 1964 in Nokosh magazine. And there's a book that she wrote called Main Kaun Hoon that came out in 2010. And in both of them, she writes about how this atmosphere that the children had at home of, that was both a sense of camaraderie, creative camaraderie between them, as well as this kind of healthy sense of competition. She writes that as a result, she has never had, such strict critics in her life as she has had, as her siblings were. So as a result, she has never been afraid of any literary critic in her life, because her siblings, trained her to be able to deal with critics. Their standards were so high, and they were so particular about what they understood, caliber was when it came to writing or painting or any creative field, really. What can a woman do if she has a room of her own?